So the agenda said federal and state. This presentation is just federal. When Jen Weiss comes tomorrow, she is the best person to talk about state incentives, not just in North Carolina, but also she's super well informed about South Carolina, which I know there's a few folks here from Virginia and Delaware. I'm happy to talk with you offline about state incentives that may be available there. But this is huge. And so I imagine everyone here has heard of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, now being called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. There are two main programs related to EV charging. So for comparison, or for context, to date in the US, all of the utility EV charging programs to date total a little over $3 billion. And the vast majority of that is California, with some in New York and Massachusetts. 3 billion plus. This program, just one of the programs in the bipartisan infrastructure law, is $5 billion over 5 years. So even if your role at your co-op or organization is not directly about strategy and funding, this is going to be transformative for the industry. So you should be aware of it and what's involved. And so what I hope to accomplish in this next 30 minutes is to make sure everyone here has at least a working understanding of these two programs in particular, NEVI program and then a grant program that I'm going to get into. So who here has heard of the NEVI program? Okay. So NEVI program is $5 billion for public fast charging along corridors. So a very specific use case. There's a caveat to that, or an addendum to it. And so what that addendum is it is for public fast charging stations, or it's for commercial vehicles, but it cannot be just for one network. It can't be just for Penske or just for FedEx or whomever. It has to be at least 2 commercial vehicle operators. But almost all the conversation around NEVI is public fast charging. And the vision behind it is to address range anxiety, to have the feds support the creation of a national cross-country network of public fast charging along major corridors so that you can get from Seattle to Miami or from Los Angeles to Maine or anywhere in between and know that there's going to be publicly available fast charging basically at points along the way. So I'll start with the funding. It's $1 billion annually for 5 years. In the first year, $300 million is set aside. The Department of Transportation, the Federal Department of Transportation and Federal Department of Energy together have set up a joint Office of Energy and Transportation to take the lead in not just NEVI, but other transportation electrification programs in coming years. But in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, it'll be $1 billion a year. Almost all of that is going to be formula funding that goes to the 50 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. If you're familiar with formula funding, it's handled by Federal Highway Administration. It goes back to the states for highway and road improvements. The way the formula is calculated, and I'm not expert in it, but it has to do with the amount of highway or gas taxes the states send to the feds, and then that determines, or partially determines, the how it's apportioned and the monies go back to the states. There's this additional provision that I don't know much about yet, which is that 10% or $100 million a year, the Secretary of Transportation, Buttigieg, can withhold 10% for gap filling. And so gap filling and addressing underserved areas is a huge theme of this, of the whole bipartisan infrastructure law. So I'm just want to give you a big information dump about this. I'll hit a couple slides about this, pause for questions, and then I'll move on to the grant program. Because it's formula funding, the money goes to the states. So the states are the ones who are going to figure out how this money is spent. It does not mean that states are going to own and operate the money themselves, the charters themselves, but the closest analogy I have is the Volkswagen settlement, where Volkswagen gave the money to the states, and then each state came up with its plan for how it intended to deploy it. In Virginia, you had a one winner take all, so EVgo won the whole contract to do fast charging across the state, but a lot of states are taking different approaches. States may contract out with private companies, so states may put grants out and say, hey, private companies, do you want to own and operate charging stations? Or, hey, rural electric co-ops, or nonprofit transportation planning organizations. I mean, there's a lot of flexibility, but ultimately the state is going to be the key decider in terms of how the state spends the money. Eligible costs include purchase, installation, and OEM, O&M, operations maintenance. Federal cost share is capped at 80%. And so the potential for states to say, there's huge potential for states to fund an enormous amount of the costs. So, and I'm going to get into more specifics about requirements for the actual charging stations, but just remember this. Federal cost share is capped at 80%, including, so purchase, installation costs, and operations and maintenance for 5 years. So the feds can potentially cover 80% of that. So huge amount that could potentially be covered. And then there's been some discussion about battery storage and renewables. There's different language around battery storage and renewables. One certainty is that if it leads to a lowest cost deployment, then it's a no-brainer. If you're in the middle of a remote area, there's not grid capacity, and the applicant can demonstrate, hey, I'm going to have a solar array and I'm going to have a battery, and that's a lot cheaper. It's a cheaper non-miles on wires alternative. That's a no-brainer. It's a little muddier, to me at least, when it's not necessarily the lowest cost alternative. But there's definitely encouragement for renewables and storage. I imagine there may be questions about this, but if you can hold them, I have a few more slides. This is the estimated apportionment, which is based on the formula funding. The state that's getting the most over 5 years is Texas at $408 million. And that's due to, again, how the apportionment is calculated based on highway taxes. That's why Texas is getting, I'm sorry, gas taxes. That's why Texas is getting more than California. These are the 15 largest states. So this column is the 5-year funding. So North Carolina is number 10 at $109 million over 5 years. Virginia is at 106 million. South Carolina is number 21, I believe, at 70 million over 5 years. This is the fiscal year 22 funding. So this is money the states have already received. They can't spend it yet for this fiscal year. So North Carolina is sitting on 16 million just for 22. Virginia is sitting on over 15 million. So like I said, it's historic levels of funding in the industry. Notice that point on the left, that this funding is contingent upon DOT approval of each state's plan. And so here's the process for this. So the president signed the law on November 15th of last year. The law said Federal Highway Administration had 90 days to publish guidance. On February 10th, Secretary Buttigieg and Granholm and some other senior cabinet officials released the initial guidance at this big event at DOT in Washington, D.C. Both Buttigieg and Granholm had their Ford Mach-E's, like their official secretarial vehicles, like vanity plates, like Charge Up or something like that, but putting a lot of emphasis behind this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that guidance says, some key considerations in it. FHWA also said to the states, send us more nominations for your alternative fuel corridors, because one of the key considerations for deploying this funding is to start with the alternative fuel corridors. That's really going to be important. Within 6 months, May 13th, the bipartisan infrastructure law said the Federal Highway Administration was supposed to publish minimum charging standards. That has not happened. We're expecting them possibly this Thursday or Friday, because there's another big EV charging symposium and showcase that DOT is hosting in DC at the end of this week. So we would not be surprised if they use that to release the standards. In terms of the state plans, each state is required to submit its EV infrastructure plan by August 1st. And Jen Weiss, when she comes tomorrow morning, will no doubt talk a lot about North Carolina's state planning efforts. North Carolina really had a leg up due to the executive order that was mentioned earlier in developing a really robust statewide electric transportation plan. But like I was saying, the states cannot just go ahead and spend the money. They need to submit a plan, the General Highway Administration, for how they want to do it. FHWA has until September 30th to approve or reject them. They'll work with the states, if it's not immediately approved. But if the state does not submit a plan at all, then the Federal Highway Administration can take that money and reapportion it out to the other states. I had mentioned earlier that Secretary Buttigieg is going to set aside 10% for gap filling. That guidance has not come out yet. There's a separate discretionary grant program guidance that we expect in November. All right, so here's the last slide just on the NEVI program. I know it's a lot, and I'll pause after this slide. So the requirements for these public fast charging stations, 4 150 kW DC fast chargers capable of simultaneously charging at that power level. So we're looking at 600 kilowatt installations. The states have to commit to having them operational for 5 years. So if you remember earlier, I said the feds may cover up to 80% of not just purchase and installation, but O&M. That's 5 years O&M. This is a key point in the industry, reliability. Ongoing operations and maintenance and just having chargers be available has become a big issue in the EV charging industry. So the feds are saying, here's a floor of 97% reliability. It's uncertain what that means. Does it mean per plug? Does it mean for the location? Does it mean whether or not grid power is up or down? There's all sorts of questions. We're waiting to see what that guidance is. So this is minimum requirements. Also encouragement for future proofing. To support expansion. Even though the minimum is 150 kW, there's encouragement for 350 kilowatts. There's encouragement for more than 4 plugs, to host either now or, a few years from now to put in the make ready to do some of the trenching and conduit and other steps to support future installations. And here's something that we've touched on a little bit. I'm going to talk at length about this tomorrow, the open protocols and standards. The feds want to make sure that this $5 billion that they're investing that's going to flow through the states will not result in stranded assets that will continue to be. Okay. So this is a lot just about NEVI. Let me pause here and ask any questions. Yeah.
Do the states have any ability to deviate from that, or is that just they have to do these, period?
It can do more. And I think the states, some states may offer state incentives for X, Y, or Z on top of this, but it has to be.
It has to be 600 kW.
Let me take that back, because there is a provision for case-by-case waivers or exceptions. But the feds have made very clear that they do not want to, like, only very sparingly would they consider it. And my guess is that the states would have to demonstrate how even solar and storage, is not feasible.
Buy America?
Yes.
Any update on
So, so that's another good question. So Robbie asked about Buy America. So the bipartisan infrastructure law has a whole title in the statute about Buy America, Made in America. It was not part of the infrastructure law, but if Congress ever takes actions to extend or expand some of these tax credits, the EV charging infrastructure tax credits in particular, at least in the version the House of Representatives passed last year, there was additional language about domestic content and labor and workforce development, as part of accessing those tax credits. So the short answer is yes, the administration is very intent on leveraging this $5 billion to spur domestic manufacturing. However, the administration understands that, at least as of today, the EV charging infrastructure industry is not in a position to meet that today. Tritium just announced they're going to open a factory in Tennessee. The plan was they'd be able to start deliveries in Q4 of this year. I don't know if that's going to happen. Some of my colleagues from Schneider and ABB and others can speak to their company's plans. I think it's fair to say that a bunch of manufacturers have plans to open up domestic manufacturing. And I think the administration is going to temper their focus on Buy American with their priority to get these funds rolled out. So I think we're going to see waivers to that, at least in years 1 and 2, I'm guessing. Yeah.
Davis Bacon wages apply on the install side.
I don't believe in the bipartisan infrastructure law. I will double check that and get back to you. But prevailing wage was definitely part of the tax credit thing that never went anywhere. All right, let me move on. 2 points about alternative fuel corridors. States were supposed to, or were required to, submit any new nominations by May 13th, so that's now closed. But if you're familiar with the EV alternative fuel corridors in your states, there's certain requirements or certain factors where Federal Highway Administration will say, okay, here's an EV-ready corridor. The old requirements only required 2 50-kilowatt chargers every 50 miles to be designated as an alternative fuel corridor. Under NEVI, that no longer counts. So we're going to see states that already have designated EV corridors in their states have a need to go back and fully build those out under NEVI. So what that means is you're going to see states using NEVI funds to put chargers on corridors that don't have public charging, and you're going to see states use NEVI funds to upsize existing locations. One other point is that in year 1, Federal Highway Administration wants states to focus just on the interstates, not on U.S. routes or other alternative fuel corridors. So what does all of this mean for you? It means that if you have not already, you should be mapping, you should go to your Federal Highway Administration or your state DOT, identify where the alternative fuel corridors are that go through your service territories. And you should start doing hosting capacity maps and overlaying those with the alternative fuel corridors and start planning ahead, because there's going to be 600 kilowatt plus charging locations every 50 miles, if not this year, then next year or the following year, et cetera. So just in terms of your ability to provide reliable service, that's a consideration that you have. But another consideration is to the extent you want to own and operate. And in some cases, utilities and rural co-ops especially, in my personal view, are going to be best positioned to do that. You're not going to get as much interest from private owner operators, particularly in the more rural and remote areas. All right, new program. It's a competitive grant program. $2.5 billion over 5 years, so it's half the amount. Starts at $300 million this year, increases by $100 million annually up to $700 million in fiscal year 2050. Not formula funding. So this funding will not be governed by state plans. This is competitive grants. They have not issued the guidance. We're expecting the guidance in November, but applicants will apply directly to USDOT. The $2.5 billion is broken out into two buckets. $1.25 billion also for corridor public charging. But then the other half of it, $1.25 billion, is for destination and community charging. So this is an opportunity to expand access to charging to communities, downtowns, to underserved areas that are, not within a mile of major alternative fuel corridors. Another key point is eligible applicants. The pool of applicants, private for-profit businesses are still not eligible, but basically public or quasi-public entities are eligible to apply directly to USDOT. And what I'm expecting is that we're going to see a lot of partnerships. It may be led by a state, it may be led by a metropolitan planning organization, or, some sort of public-private NGO. But there's going to be partnerships involved, partnerships that involve infrastructure providers, that may involve rideshare operators like Ubers or Lyfts or taxi cabs. It may involve like workforce development companies, or organizations that have shuttle service. It may involve utilities, particularly rural co-ops who serve underserved areas. So, and here we go. So 5 years operations and maintenance is eligible again. Maximum grant 15 million, and again, you have an 80% federal cap. The type of fuel is broader. It's not just electric vehicles. You can see it's alternative fuels, hydrogen, propane, and natural gas fueling is also eligible. And so from your perspective, speaking to the co-ops, one way to think about this grant program is to think about what are some of your existing goals and strategic planning. Like, what are some investments that you will likely need to make over the next 3 to 5 years? And they may or may not be directly related to electric vehicles, but I would be thinking about how you can, get plugged in to this competitive grant program, again, once the guidance is released, because there may be opportunities there to support upgrades as well as charging that are in line with where you want to go as a co-op already. So I think it's a good opportunity. It's something that should at least be on your radar because there's going to be significant funding there that your members will not have to pay for, at least 80% of it. All right, so I think this is my last slide. I'm not going to go through all of this. Like I said, I'm expecting this Thursday or Friday, I'm not certain, but I'm expecting Federal Highway Administration to release the minimum charging standards that will definitely apply to NEVI. And I'm expecting it will likely apply to this upcoming competitive grant program as well. All of these slides, my understanding, will be available. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but you can see the feds are thinking about a lot of the same questions all of you have expressed. From signage, data collection is a huge thing. The feds want data. They want data to help inform planning, both transportation and infrastructure planning, as well as energy management for utilities. Payment, making sure that these chargers are publicly accessible for someone who may only have a credit card. Stranded asset mitigation. So there's a lot of stuff. All right. So the main takeaway is over the next 5 years, including this year, the feds are going to be releasing $7.5 billion, which is roughly twice all of the utility spending on EV infrastructure programs to date. Even still, that's not going to be enough. There's an organization called Atlas Public Policy, which looks at various state and federal emissions reductions goals and the amount of EVs that are needed. And they're anticipating that the NEVI program will cover between 9 and 13% of the needed infrastructure. So there's going to be significant need for utility and other private investment as well. But it's huge enough that people, I'm sure, will be asking you questions about it, your boards of directors, community members. So I would encourage you to at least be familiar with the broad outlines of it, even if it's not directly your area of responsibility. Any final question or two before I turn it back over? Yeah.
There's also, as part of this bill, there's a carbon reduction program. It's $6.4 billion to reduce emissions. And I think Jennifer Weiss tomorrow will talk about that because it includes like reducing mileage, adding bike lanes, but it also includes providing EV charging with zero emissions. It could be from distributed energy resources or things like that. So right now is the time to give your input to DOTs so that they include that in their plans.
Clarifying questions. Two of them. You said the guidance on that second program has not been released. When do you anticipate it will be?
November. And the feds may actually put out the request for grants at the time of the guidance in November.
Wow. Okay. And the second one, the Atlas Public Policy citation, what was that number again? The range?
It was focused just on public charging, and it said NEVI, they anticipate will cover 9 to 13% of the needed funding. And I can give you more detail on that afterwards. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.